Sounds like a job for the Department of Government Efficiency.
Once
Too
they
soon?
Too soon, or it's still very fresh, Tom. Uh, Once they get rid of the staffers that would actually work on permitting, then they're going to realize they actually needed those employees in order to be more efficient. So they may not realize that now, but over time they perhaps will.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Chris. Chris, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Tom. It's great to be with you. My name is Chris Moyer. I'm the president and founder of Echo Communications Advisors. We are a strategic communications firm based in Washington, D.C. that works with climate advocacy organizations, with climate tech startups, with renewable energy companies to shape federal and state policies and regulations as we work towards the energy transition.
And why? As in, what got you into this? What made you wake up one morning and go, I know, I'll start Echo Communications Advisors?
So I started the firm about 5 years ago, but really what got me started on this was going back about 15 years ago, at the beginning of my career. I was working for the US Senate Majority Leader at the time, someone named Harry Reid, who is from the state of Nevada. And Nevada, as you may know, is one of the most important states for clean energy in the country. They have vast swaths of federal land that allow for solar, and there's great geothermal resources. And I remember being with the senator in Las Vegas, and we were visiting a solar array. And that was shortly after some really important legislation was passed back in 2009 to spur further investment in solar, wind, other clean energy sources. And throughout my career, these last 15 years, it's always been part of the work that I've done, working in government and politics, and always been working towards pushing policies that are better for climate and for electrifying everything and moving towards a better system.
Okay, and what would you say has surprised you most in your journey these last 15 years?
Well, I would say even more recently is seeing all this climate tech startup companies and all the different ways they are looking at addressing climate change. It's hundreds, and there's so many innovators both in the United States and outside the United States, and they're receiving some really important financial support and investment. We need to keep nurturing those because it's going to take all hands on deck to solve the challenges and meet the goals that are being set, reaching net zero, and just finding better ways of doing things instead of just staying with the status quo.
They're not all giving up and going home now that the new administration is after taking office.
No, I think that's not the mentality of a lot of entrepreneurs anyway. They're not going to, they're facing hurdles all the time, and that's all about problem solving. And just because, the election didn't go the way that many would have liked, they just find ways around it. So they're really admirable in how they solve challenges, and they wouldn't be in this position if they were ones to give up so easily. But there are certainly headwinds that are making their jobs a lot harder.
Yeah, I mean, we talked on the intro call about this and about the very real sense of climate fatigue or even despair that's creeping in as a consequence of the new administration and as a consequence of what they're doing. Do you think people are right to feel despair? And are there any bright spots that they should be looking out for if they are feeling despair?
Well, it's hard not to feel despair. The way the year started was an intentional shock and awe approach, and really trying to throw as much against the wall, not just on climate and clean energy, but really on a lot of issues. But certainly climate is among the top targets. And whether you're talking about withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement or cutting back on energy incentives and trying to cancel contracts that have already been signed, there's a whole program to set up a national green bank, which a lot of countries have used to great effect for financing energy projects, clean energy projects, and it's certainly helping with low-income communities that are often left behind by private investment, and green banks help to bridge that gap. That was put into place, contracts were signed, and now the current administration is attacking and trying to pull that back. There's rollback of energy efficiency standards, trying to get rid of Energy Star. I promise I'll get to some good news here, but I think it's important to kind of
Context setting.
lay out the scope, just staffing cutbacks at all the important agencies in the federal government, which make it really, there's a brain drain. There's scientists, there's people who know how things work very well. That's not easily recoverable. Offshore wind is taking a massive hit. There was a project just a few weeks ago, Empire Wind in New York, that had gone through a very expensive and rigorous vetting process. And it's pure politics. They're not even trying to pretend otherwise for why they put a stop work order forward. And so that's under threat. And there's on and on. I won't go through every single thing. That would take up the entire conversation. But I think what is happening is people are adapting. The clean energy, climate community is adapting. There's things that we can control and things we can't control, but even just the messaging and communication about some of these existing programs, about some of the progress being made in the private sector, how you talk about these issues matters quite a bit. And we're seeing a lot of companies reframing to fit within the so-and-so energy dominance message and theme. Was that the framing we would put around it ourselves if we were in charge? No, but the reality is for the next 4 years, these are the folks we have to reach. They're the decision makers, and for a lot of decisions that affect how fast progress will be made. And I do want to underscore, progress will continue. It's just a matter of the pace. There's so much going on outside of federal government, private investment. I mentioned the entrepreneurs that are really doing great work. And there's enough momentum that progress will continue. The question is how fast? And we clearly need that to be as fast as possible to reach all these goals that have been set for net zero. States have really ambitious goals for 2030, for the year might vary, but certainly by 2050. And we need to make progress as quickly as we can. But so it's trying to minimize the setbacks. And if there's a way to talk about issues, I don't think we want to talk about global temperatures rising and climate catastrophe and the alarmist approach. That's not really going to resonate with key folks at this time. But you can talk about jobs that are being created by these projects in communities, especially in more conservative areas that may support the current president. You want to talk about tax revenue. You want to talk about the United States winning the battle with competitors like China for these important industries of the future, and not just the future, but today, whether it's building battery factories or critical minerals or parts for solar panels, things like that. There's a lot that the US could be doing and is on track to do because of legislation that passed federally in the last few years, but is at risk of being undermined. And, there's also an effort by the current administration, or at least they talk about wanting to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Clean energy offers a great way to do that. And so there are things that are at odds with each other, with stated goals of the administration and some of their actions that undermine those goals that they have, whether it's looking at different energy sources that could use more federal support, that have bipartisan support, whether it's, again, lowering energy costs. That was a big factor in the last election, is energy bills and the cost of living. There are decisions that will be made that will have an impact on all of those things that are important for everybody.
And you got to keep in mind, I guess, that although Trump has said he wants to bring back coal, clean coal as he calls it, economically that's unlikely to happen just because coal is a lot more expensive now than solar, right?
Yes, but he's certainly going to try. One of the questions that his recent executive orders really begs is, it says in his order that coal plants that are even failing financially must remain open. And are they going to pick up the cost of that? Or are they going to force the private company to lose money on that? Part of it is messaging. Part of it is they do probably want to achieve this, but there's so much working against it and it's just not practical. You mentioned cost. That's the biggest factor, of course, but it's not practical or workable, even with the president putting full force behind trying to do that.
Yeah. And you mentioned as well that several states have ambitious net zero goals. So There's a weird kind of tension there between the federal government and the more local state governments. How is that playing out in general, do you think?
Well, President Trump has tried to crack down on states and their climate laws, saying that his Department of Justice, which is supposed to be independent from the president, will go after state climate laws and in court. But the collective response from many state legislators and governors to that has been a shrug because it doesn't seem like that's actually possible. So these states are continuing to work on their own goals and are not going to let federal government actions deter them. And in fact, they are more important if the federal government is not going to lead on this. And so there is progress being made. And that's one of the areas that offers some hope. Places like Massachusetts and New York and California and others. The other piece of this is that state attorneys general, they're the top law enforcement officer, and they also have a consumer advocacy role, are fighting in court the federal actions to roll back really important provisions, whether it's tailpipe emissions or any number of actions that the administration has taken so far. And, it takes a while for these court cases to play out, but generally we see that they're quite often very successful, and they may not get the headlines that the initial announcement from the administration gets, but over time they do build up a pretty impressive win-loss record against the administration.
And do you have examples of cities or states that are getting it right regardless of the federal headwinds?
A good example is Massachusetts. Just a few months ago, passed a pretty comprehensive, ambitious state law that would really phase out more quickly natural gas, and they set up some of these utilities to make major changes that would be critically important that they don't make on their own, and they need the push. New York has instituted what's called congestion pricing. So if you go drive a car into New York City, you have to pay a toll. And what it does is reduce the number of cars and improves the air quality in the
Mhm.
city. It's only new. The Trump administration is trying to force the city and the state actually to halt that program, but they are keeping it going.
And if I read correctly, that congestion charge, they ring fence the money and put it into improving public transportation, right?
That's right.
Okay, great. You mentioned geothermal there in respect of Nevada, for example. Not the only place, but obviously Nevada has some really good geothermal potential. It's a technology, though, that up until now hasn't really taken off for a number of reasons. I got to think. One, it's geographically bound. We mentioned Nevada because it has good resources, but not everywhere does. So it's something you can only roll out in certain regions, and consequently, it doesn't scale. And consequently, the cost of geothermal is quite high per megawatt delivered. But it seems to be, for some reason, recently, if you'll pardon the pun, bubbling back up to the surface again. Is that
Well, the
is that your
first
experience? Have you seen that as well?
Tom, the first thing you learn about geothermal is that it is an industry that loves its puns, and there are plenty of
Oh,
them.
good.
I would say that the industry is gaining steam to keep the
Oh,
puns going. And the exciting thing about geothermal is that it provides consistent baseload power. And
mm,
the criticism certainly of solar and wind is that they're intermittent. And geothermal has the
mhm,
potential to pair very well with those sources. And it doesn't require a lot of land. It's either low carbon or carbon free operations. Doesn't
mhm,
require much water. When you're talking about the West, water is always of significant concern given the scarcity. And so it doesn't require much water. It takes the technology from the oil and gas industry, which means that there's a lot of know-how. There's engineers, there's geologists, there's folks who know how to drill. And
mm,
they can, instead of going a fossil fuel, they can just tap into the heat beneath our feet. And it's a perpetual energy source, and it's heating, cooling, electricity. You mentioned the geographic limitations. One of the exciting things is that there's advanced geothermal, which traditional geothermal, you have to have heat very close to the surface of the land. That's why traditionally the West in the United States and also places like Iceland have been very, very good places for tapping into that heat. because the deeper you drill, the more expensive it becomes. But the exciting thing with
Yep.
advanced geothermal, or next gen geothermal, as they're called, and there's some different subcategories. I won't get into all the specifics of how each of them works, but the vision there is that you could have geothermal anywhere. You could drill, if you go deep enough, you will get heat. And it's just a matter of bringing the cost curve down for the technology. Because, like I said, the deeper you go, the more expensive it gets. And you need to be able to make sure that you have the right tools or right infrastructure to reach that heat. The deeper you go, it can be 3 to 5 miles below the surface. But the vision, if we can get the cost curve down, and significant progress is being made in the last few years on bringing the cost down and getting the technology right, it's very exciting. And there's a ton of potential. It's a bipartisan issue in the United States. Republicans love it because it has the kind of the DNA of the oil and gas industry. And there's a real ability for workers to transition seamlessly into geothermal. And then more progressive folks like it as well, because I mentioned the carbon-free operations, the little to no environmental impact. You can take some mines or holes that have already been drilled and use those. You don't even always have to drill new holes. You might have to go a little deeper, but and then the potential again of it being a reliable, renewable source of energy that, as you consider AI, and everyone talks about AI and the demand for energy on data centers, let's see that play out a little bit more. But there's the potential to pair the geothermal plants right with an AI data center, and you wouldn't even have to connect to the grid necessarily. And that is a huge opportunity and advantage.
I had an episode of the podcast a few weeks back with a patent lawyer called Ryan Schermerhorn. We talked about innovators finding workarounds when the climate patent fast track was killed off. Are there equivalent workarounds today when federal policy seems kind of to be stuck or breaking down or going backwards?
Yes, and often that means going to a different country. It's why these policies matter. And there's some legislation being considered in the United States right now that would cause some entities to invest elsewhere. But I know in the geothermal space, there is one advanced geothermal company that was able to get approvals much faster in Germany. And so they're building an advanced geothermal site in Germany that should be online later this year. And they were able to get approvals in 2 years. That would take at least 5 in the United States. And it speaks to the larger issue of permitting in the United States that is a huge problem. I mentioned earlier legislation that was passed a few years ago, the Inflation Reduction Act, that provided generational incentives for clean energy sources, and they're largely tax credits. That's great, but the final stage is not passing legislation. It's actually allowing these projects to move forward. Environmental review is very important, but do you need 5, 6 agencies doing the same thing? Do you need I exaggerate a little bit there, but to make the point that there is significant duplication, and there has to be a way to streamline that. There's been some moves to streamline permitting on some federal lands, but that has to be done responsibly. One of the challenges is and I'll get to this a little bit more a little later in our conversation, but the local communities need to be on board because they are often barriers for building these projects, whether it's a solar array or some other type of renewable energy project. So permitting reform is something that the Congress here has looked at doing. They came close in December of 2024, just a few months back, but we're not able to strike a deal. And there's some re-emerging hope that maybe later in 2025, there could be some bipartisan opportunity to pass something that would speed up the permitting, allow some of these projects to actually proceed.
Sounds like a job for the Department of Government Efficiency.
Once they
Too soon?
Too soon, or it's still very fresh, Tom. Once they get rid of the staffers that would actually work on permitting, then they're going to realize they actually needed those employees in order to be more efficient. So they may not realize that now, but over time they perhaps will.
No doubt, no doubt. What's the role of corporate advocacy here, Chris? Are companies doing enough, or is this a moment to really step up?
I'd say at the beginning of this Trump administration, it's been a much different story than the beginning of the first one. You had huge outcry, including from Elon Musk himself, after Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord in 2017. He did that on day one of his term this time, and there were crickets. And so that speaks to a broader kind of bowing down that everyone in, you've seen it from academia to a point, you've seen it from business leaders who don't want to get on his bad side. And there's real fear of retribution. But I think there also is room to speak out on things that are important to you, your business, to society. And we are seeing, specifically when it comes to legislation, the companies that stand to lose the most from repealing of tax credits or phase out of tax credits, whether it's solar executives, wind executives, hydrogen, carbon capture, all the different affected industries, they're advocating for this legislation to stay in place. Um, but there's been largely not as many voices and not as loudly speaking out as they could be.
For people who are listening, who are feeling overwhelmed or discouraged, what's one thing they could do today to keep pushing for progress, whether in their company, their community, or just conversations?
From a company standpoint, I'd say keep working to do what your mission is, to keep advancing your product, to make it the best possible, to make it appealing. I think communicating about the benefits of what you're doing for a community in terms of job creation, in terms of expanding the tax base, in terms of helping to lower energy prices, that is really important, and it cuts across party lines if you can really tell that story effectively. If you're in the United States, and certainly anything that is made in the United States is going to be pretty well received, advocacy organizations should continue to speak out and make clear, and do it in a way that will resonate. You kind of have to read the room on how, like I was saying earlier, how you talk about these things. There are points to emphasize, like US leadership, like reshoring of manufacturing jobs, winning the global race on AI, energy dominance. Again, doesn't mean that's not how we would necessarily frame it, but it is a way to be effective in this moment that we're in. And I also think that there's, in your local community, there's opportunities to be part of moving things forward. There's an organization that is trying to do this type of work. They're called Greenlight America, and they identified the problem that I was referring to a moment ago, in that these big projects that would really, again, could be a solar project, wind, whatever the case may be, they were failing to get approval in their local community. So city council might vote against the project because at the city council meeting, they had a few people who were fed misinformation from fossil fuel industry, from Fox News, other right-wing outlets about this really fear mongering about what these projects would do. And they were the only ones that would show up for these meetings. There was no one on the
Mm.
pro clean energy side that would come ready to say why this is good for the community. And so what this organization has been working to do since they started last year is change that. They don't want to lose by forfeit anymore. And so
Yeah.
a few cool things they do. They have a mobilization hub that provides all the tools and resources, talking points. They have an early warning system, which I think is really cool, that they identify, there's a lot of different jurisdictions in the United States, and it's hard to track
Yeah.
all of them. But if you can find out where these votes are happening, then you can engage and mobilize and start to shape things for the better. And so that's what they're doing. And it's a critical effort. I think the developers of these projects understand that they need to get community buy-in. And for whatever reason, they have not had as much success to this point as we frankly need them to.
What's one reason that you're staying in this fight, Chris, even when the odds look tough?
Well, I think if you take a bigger picture view, the energy transition is happening over a long period of time. And this is only a setback at the federal level, this time that we're in. This is a 4-year period. We'll see where the next elections go. But there's so much work to be done. And the thing that our team brings is a way to help communicate and really leverage the power of communication to be part of the solution. We're just one part of it, but I think it's a really critical part. The messaging matters. How you talk about things matters. And it's going to be something that is happening the rest of my life, the rest of our lives, that is inevitable. But again, we need to make it happen faster. And there's an urgency there. I appreciate working with a sense of urgency, and there's no shortage of that here.
Okay. Yep. Makes sense. Are there any books, any films, documentaries, or anything like that that you found particularly inspiring when thinking about all this?
Well, one of the things that I have really wanted to understand better is the history of the electric grid. And the way it is today is not as it would be if we were to start over and say that we're going to design it the most efficient way, the most sustainable way, but it's not possible, of course, to start over. So I was really curious to understand how we got to where we are, going back to Thomas Edison and the first power lines in New York City and the progress over the last many decades and how we can learn from that history. There's a book, it's called Grid, and it's a really, really well done book that provides great history and I think helps us think about how to move forward, and underscores the importance of, even if we get everything else right, you have to connect all these projects to the grid. And that's the challenge. There's a backlog with a lot of the operators, the folks that are in charge of making sure there's enough supply to meet demand. And there's just a huge backlog. And often it feels like renewables are given short shrift as they are waiting for a long time to get connected to the grid. So the transmission piece is very important. That's something that is a priority for, or should be a priority for, any sort of permitting reform that Congress undertakes. And yeah, the grid is really central to everything that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Left field question for you, Chris.
Yes.
If you could have any person or character, alive or dead, real or fictional, as a champion for clean energy and grids, who would it be and why?
Another great question. I think just given the political moment that we're in, there's always a reverence for former President Reagan. And that's kind of adapted to fit the politicians, whatever political agenda. It's conservatives that are always glorifying him. And given the fact that it's conservatives who run the federal government at this moment, if you could have President Reagan coming back and advocating for a lot of the clean energy and all the progress towards the energy transition, that would probably be a really effective, he would be an effective spokesperson.
Nice. Great. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Chris. Is there any question I have not asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
Yeah, I would just a few things that I tried to, generally it's good to try to find some positives in a despite the dark cloud hanging over. Again, I'm here in Washington D.C., so right in the thick of it. But I think there's 3 stories that I've seen recently that offer some hope. One is, and we touched on this off air, but the fact that 1 in 4 cars are electric vehicles, according to the IEA, and that is an increase from 1 in 5 from the year before. So we are seeing adoption. Could that be faster? Sure, but it's going in the right direction, and that is a very positive thing. A second,
just to clarify on that for people listening, Chris, I know what you meant, but it's 1 in 4 cars sold. So new cars sold this year will be an electric vehicle, whereas last year it was 1 in 5 new cars sold. So the figures are going in the right direction.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that it's cars sold. That is an important clarification. And another story is GM just said that they have some technology that could allow them to have more efficient, compact, smaller batteries, which they can put into
Mm.
some of their SUVs and bring the price down. So that is an important development. A lot of Americans really love SUVs, and being able to provide those at the same cost as ICE cars is major progress. And so
Yeah.
seeing how that plays out, that's a real positive sign. Another thing, and this is something that I'm excited about, is that the 2028 Olympics, the Summer Olympics, will be in Los Angeles, and a company called Archer Aviation, California-based company, will provide air taxi services to the games. So if you're a fan, attendee, even athletes, there's going to be this ability to use the electric vehicle takeoff and landing ETOL. This could also be used for emergency services, and it's certainly cleaner and it's more convenient potentially. I don't know what the cost will be,
Mhm.
but this is something that seems to be making some progress. There's some partnerships with major commercial airlines that are just beginning, and something that could eventually be more widely adopted. It's great that the games will be able to shine a spotlight and people experience that. And we'll see what the opportunities might be down the road for a mass adoption and use.
Chris, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
So folks can visit echocomms.com. That's comms with two M's, COMM, echocomms.com. There's a link there to my LinkedIn, and I'm a frequent user of LinkedIn and happy to connect with anybody. So those would certainly be the best places to find me.
Great. And I'll put links to those in the show notes as well for people to find them. Chris, that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Tom. Great chatting with you.